everyone. So today in class, we talked about how to mark a text. And specifically, we talked about the narrative structure of Story of an Hour. So with that story, you mark that on your own. And then given our time constraints, what I want to do now is I want to walk you through a full text marking of Kate Chopin's Story of an Hour. Basically just as an example of how to consider the text that we read for AICE Literature. So sit tight, add to your own markings as we go through, and we're going to talk about Story of an Hour. So hang on, we'll get started in just a second. Okay, so obviously we're starting at the beginning. We want to take a look at our first sentence. And the first thing that we should notice is that we have our character, Mrs. Mallard, and it tells us in the very first sentence that she was afflicted with a heart trouble. And so when we're thinking about this, we've got this idea of the trouble being symbolic, right? Like any kind of bodily illness is going to be also like an emotional or a spiritual illness. And we need to also think about the idea of a heart specifically. Like that deals with this idea of love and also of like relationships. And so we know that there's some sort of issue that's going along with that. And we get the conflict already as well. We know that her husband's death is our first major conflict to deal with. In the next paragraph, it talks about how Mrs. Mallard is informed. We have this idea that it's, of course, it's her sister who tells her. So this is another one of our characters. And it talks about how she tells her in broken sentences, in veiled hints, and these things that reveal and half also concealing. And so what we're looking at here is we're seeing in the way that Chopin uses language to discuss like the problems with the way that she's told, or the delicacy with which she's told. All of that, like that connotative language really reveals the fragility of Mrs. Mallard. We get this idea here that, her husband's friend Richards was there as well. This is another one of our characters. And then we get this reinforcement of how he has assured himself, right? So like this death is a certain thing. And of course that is irony because we have already read it. We know at the end that Brentley Mallard is not in fact dead. And so he is the person who is wanting to tell Mrs. Mallard because he is afraid that someone else will be less careful or less tender. So again, that repetition of, oh no, like someone who is less careful and less tender, that can harm Mrs. Mallard. And of course then we see the irony of that as well because it is not this news that is harmful to her. As we are looking at this, we get some interesting description of how Mrs. Mallard is as she hears the story. So it says she did not hear the story as many women have heard the same. So this tells us already with that that negative right there that Louise Mallard is not like other women. And so because she is not like other women would have been paralyzed, right? Would have had this inability to accept it. But because she is not like other women, she is not paralyzed. So we see from the very beginning that Chopin is telling us that Mrs. Mallard is capable of action. So when she does react to her husband's death, it says she wept at once with sudden wild abandonment in her sister's arms. So we're seeing this imagery of grief. And then we also want to take note of the next sentence, right? Where it says, when the storm of grief had spent itself, she went away to her room alone. So this idea of like the storm, this metaphor, the storm of grief. Please keep that in mind because we're going to keep coming back to this idea. So she goes to her room alone, and it reinforces that by saying that no one's going to follow her, so it focuses on her isolation. When we get to her room, it says that there stood, facing the open window, a comfortable, roomy armchair. There's a couple things that are interesting about this. First of all, I want to talk for just a moment about the idea of like the expectation, right? The expectation of how and what Mrs. Mallard is going to be feeling. After her husband's death, we, of course, have this expectation that she'll be grieving, that things will be sad. And I want us to keep that in mind as we explore how Chopin actually characterizes what happens to Mrs. Mallard after her husband's death. When she goes into her room, first of all, it talks about like the comfortable, roomy armchair. And so that description, this imagery, and especially this connotative language of like the comfort that's available to her, and then also this idea of an open window. This is really interesting symbolically because an open window in a lot of ways represents escape, and it represents freedom. And so when she gets into her room, she is facing this open window that represents escape and freedom. It also helps us see this idea that she is, that there's no barrier between her and the outside because the window is open and not closed. And so as she gets into her room, it says that she sinks down into this chair, this comfortable chair, pressed down by a physical exhaustion that haunted her body and seemed to reach into her soul. So there's this focus here on like the physical, the outside reactions of Louise Mallard. And they seem to be in line, right? She's exhausted. She is sinking into her chair. And so as she sinks into her chair, the next thing we get is a description of what she sees. And so it says she could see in the open square before her house the tops of trees. So first of all, we have her looking through this open window into the open square. So again, this idea of openness is reinforced for us. And so she's seeing the trees, so this idea of nature, and not just nature, but trees that are all aquiver with new spring life. It talks about the delicious breath of rain. So again, we have this personification of the rain. It's breathing, right? So it's being given this human characteristic of life. And so we have this like visual imagery of all of that. We get the auditory imagery here of a peddler crying his wares, the song of someone singing, the sparrows twittering in the eaves. So all of this auditory imagery of, in a lot of ways, song. And so that's interesting because when do you sing? You sing a lot of times in celebration, right? So there's this weird kind of like celebratory thing that's happening here. There's this very interesting kind of contrast between the way that we expect Mrs. Mallard to be feeling and the imagery that Chopin is providing us in a lot of ways of new life. As we're looking at this, we also get in this next thing to just further reinforce that. It says there were patches of blue sky showing here and there through the clouds. And these are clouds that had met and piled one above the other. So this sounds to me like a clearing storm, right? We've got rain that has ended. We've got clouds that are moving away because they have met already. And so now we have patches of blue showing in the sky. So we have this clearing sky, or this imagery of a clearing sky after the storm. Where else have we seen a storm just a second ago? I want to point you back to this idea of the storm of grief. So we have this metaphorical storm, and now we have this storm in the setting. And so we're supposed to, in many ways, be connecting these two ideas. So Louise Mallard's internal storm matches the weather that is outside her open window. Oops, excuse me. So, at the end of this page, it says, she sat with her head thrown back upon the cushion of the chair, quite motionless, except when a sob came up into her throat and shook her, as a child who has cried itself to sleep continues to sob in its dream. So, the first thing I want to point out is that she is, of course, sitting in her comfortable chair. It says that she's motionless. So we have this idea here of like arrested movement. This idea kind of like of stasis. She is unmoving, except for her grief. And we have this comparison of her as a child, right? So in a lot of ways, this is interesting because it emphasizes to us her innocence. In some ways, it emphasizes her immaturity. This is a simile, by the way. I should have labeled that. Maybe her immaturity, or the fact that she has not had the opportunity to exercise her maturity. And so the one thing I want to point out to us as well is that this is completely all description. Our narrator is not giving us insight into her feelings. It tells us what she is doing and what she is seeing. And I just want us to keep that in mind as we keep moving forward. So in some ways, like, we get her feelings through the descriptions that were provided. So we leave Louise Mallard sitting in her chair. As we turn the page, hopefully you're turning the page. We are going to turn the page right here. It gives us a physical description of Louise Mallard. It says she was young with a fair, calm face whose lines bespoke repression and even a certain strength. And so we have a physical description of Louise Mallard. She's fair, she's calm. Even though she's just been compared to a child, we understand that she has lines on her face. And these lines tell us two things. It emphasizes to us her strength. Of course, this is a character trait that Louise Mallard has, but it also introduces us to this idea of repression, right? That she is in a position where she is not able to be or do, the things that she wants to be or do. She is chained in many ways to the life that she has. So as we're sitting there, or as she's sitting there, it says, right now, even though she usually is, up and about, she's got this dull stare in her eyes. The gaze was fixed away, and it was fixed, interestingly enough, on one of those patches of blue sky. So again, it's fixed on, her gaze is fixed on the idea, in some ways, of escape. It was not a gaze of reflection, but rather indicated a suspension of intelligent thought. So this, again, repeats to us this motionless quality that she had. So it says here, there was something coming to her and she was waiting for it fearfully. So it's interesting because whatever this thing is that's coming, it's not named. She doesn't know what it is. She doesn't understand what this realization is. And because of that, she's frightened of it, because of its difference. It's interesting, though, because she says this is coming towards her out of the sky, reaching towards her through the sounds, the scents, the color that filled the air. So with that, we know that what she's looking at out the window, so what she sees out the window is all positive, right? It's like the new life and the trees, it's the sounds of the birds singing, all of those things, all of those are positive. So in many ways, we can say that this realization that whatever is coming to her is positive, if it's coming from this positive stuff that's in front of her. The next thing it says, now her bosom rose and fell tumultuously. This is actually really interesting because it's talking here about how she's breathing. And this is in contrast to what we had earlier, right? That stasis, that motionless stuff. Now she is back in motion. And not just motion, but imagery of motion that bespeaks this idea of life, right? Breathing. It says that she was beginning to recognize this thing that was approaching to possess her. And it says as well that as she's thinking about what's coming towards her, she's afraid of it, right? It says she was striving to beat it back. but she was powerless against it. So this realization, it overpowers her. It's too strong to be held back. And so what is this realization? What is this thing that's coming to her? What is this thought that's coming towards her? Well, I want us to look at what she says. And what she says is free, free, free. So the realization that she has is this realization of freedom. And I want us to keep this in mind because it's really interesting. This is also the first thing that we see. This is the first thing that is actually said. It's the first thing that has quotation marks. It's the first utterance in this short story. And then Chopin follows this by telling us that the vacant stare and look of terror that we had seen, so back to that like motionless stuff that we had talked about up here, it leaves her. It went from her eyes, and her eyes now stayed keen and bright. Her pulses beat fast. The coursing blood, it warms and relaxes every inch of her body. So I want you guys to look at this because all of a sudden we again have all of this imagery that describes life. So she's gone from motionless to full of life. This, in many ways, where she says free, 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 is the moment of resurrection for her. So it's not, once her husband dies, she gets to live. And that's an important moment. So once she has had this moment where we see her having this resurrection, where she is living and her husband is not, we get this oxymoron where it says that she didn't stop to ask if it were a monstrous joy that held her, which of course is what her society would feel, right? That the rejoicing that she would do in her husband's death is monstrous. It says that a clear and exalted perception enabled her to dismiss the suggestion as trivial. So this idea here, when we say that she is dismissing this idea that, you know, people are going to look down on her because she is happy or that she is enjoying the freedom that her husband's death has given her, what we're seeing here is that like her like spiritual freedom in many ways is more important than societal judgment. So that's a really important point that we need to make sure that we think about, is that this narrator, in this case, the way that she feels is more important than the way that society perceives her. It doesn't mean that she didn't love her husband, and that is what we're about to see, is that she knew that she would weep again. So we know here that we see that grief that she does feel for the death of her husband, right? It talks about what's going to make her sad, the kind, tender hands folded in death, the face that had never looked save with love upon her, fixed and gray and dead. So we have this imagery of like her dead husband, and that's going to make her sad. She says very clearly that it's going to make her sad. And it also characterizes Brentley Mallard too, that he was to her a loving husband. But that doesn't necessarily mean that everything is okay, right? Because she says, but she saw beyond that bitter moment of mourning his death a long procession of years to come that would belong to her absolutely. And of course, we see this with a lot of irony. So, because she has this anticipation for the future, for herself, that clearly does not happen. But it says that she is welcoming this idea. And so there's an interesting moment here where it talks about how his hands are folded in death and she is spreading out her arms. So again, we get this contrast between life and death that's happening as well. It goes on here, and this almost sounds like Louise's voice in this little paragraph that we're looking at here. There would be no one to live for during those coming years. She would live for herself. So there's a contrast here between living for someone and living for herself, like someone else versus herself. It says there would be no powerful will bending hers in that blind persistence which men and women believe they have a right to impose a private will upon a fellow creature. So basically she's saying that no one is going to be imposing their own will upon her. She will no longer be dealing with that repression that she spoke of earlier on this page. No longer feeling that repression. And again, just as another reminder, that doesn't mean that her husband was terrible to her, that he was a cruel husband. And this is what she points out to us, a kind intention or a cruel intention. And so, of course, we have that repetition. Made the act no less a crime as she looked upon it in that brief moment of illumination. So basically she's saying, whether you meant to repress someone or not, whether you meant to be kind or cruel to them, it doesn't matter. The end result is the same. And when she's talking about this idea of like other people imposing their will upon her, she's talking specifically about her marriage, and how she views marriage in this moment of illumination. So she's allowed to kind of see past just what her society thinks and realize kind of from this higher view, like, oh, just because, you know, he was a good husband to me doesn't mean that the institution as it's being practiced isn't cruel or harmful. And so one of the things that we should notice here is a lot of repetition and a lot of parallel structure, because it's emphasizing to us basically how she should feel versus how she actually feels. And so we have this here. And she had loved him sometimes, often she had not. She had loved him, she had not. So again, like we're talking about here with this repetition and parallel structure. And then she says, what did it matter? And it says too, what could love, the unsolved mystery, account for in the face of this possession of self-assertion? And she says that she recognizes this idea of self-assertion as the strongest impulse of her being. So this is who she is, right? Louise Mallard is someone who wants to assert herself. This is what she's been looking for. And so it's also told to us that what's more important, the self-assertion or the love, right? Most of the time we prize love as like this idea of like the highest emotion, like the most important thing. And Louise Mallard says like, nope, guess what's more important? Self-assertion, being able to be my own self. This is what she says is most important to her. And she reinforces that, and Chopin reinforces that to us as well by making this dialogue its own line. And it starts again with free, body and soul, and that again is that interesting contrast. Both the physical and the spiritual, she has been freed. So, oops, hopefully you can see that. Both the spiritual and the physical freedom that she is feeling at this moment. So she's had her moment of resurrection. She's had this reflection that we see in this part of it. And now we're going to see what happens kind of at the end of this story. I want to also remind you, where is she right now? This setting. She is still in the chair. She's still got the open window. She's still gazing outside. We've still got all of that nature imagery that we're dealing with. So all of that is happening. Now, on the next page, we're going to look at what happens when she has to kind of come back and share this realization with people. So here's an interesting thing that I want you to think about. Remember that she is there by herself. She's sitting there. She's sitting in this comfortable chair and behind this locked door. And it says that her sister Josephine was kneeling before the closed door. So this is this position of submission, right? And it says she's got her lips to the keyhole. She's imploring for admission. And she says, you'll make yourself ill. What are you doing? Open the door. You'll make yourself ill. And so it's interesting, too. There's this idea, there's this repetition of door, the closed door. You know, that they want the door to be open. For heaven's sakes, open the door. So this is interesting because Josephine is in this power of submission, or this position of submission, because who has the power? Louise Mallard has the power. She has the power that she's never had before to isolate herself, right? She has never been able to do this. And so this idea of the door that's separating herself from everybody else, this is something that is really interesting. The other thing, too, we keep calling her Louise Mallard because we know that's her name. But I want to point out to you that this is the first time that her name is used. Up until this point, she has been Mrs. Mallard. And now for the first time, she is Louise. So we have this reclaiming of her own identity through the use of her name. And that's so important. And so it's interesting. She says, you'll make yourself ill. And so, of course, we've got that idea of illness. Also, the irony there. She's not making herself ill. This is the most well that she has been maybe in her whole life. And that is what she says. Go away. I am not making myself ill. And in fact, then we get that reflection. It says, no, and she was drinking in the very elixir of life through that open window. So again, that idea of freedom that we see here, and this metaphor of that idea like the elixir of life, that freedom is giving to her. So as we continue to look at this, it says her fancy was running riot along all those days ahead of her. Spring days, summer days, all sorts of days. Oh man, look at all of this repetition of days. All of these time units. Oops, that's not how you spell repetition. Oh man, dang. That's why this is hard to do in real time. So this repetition, and of course that leads us to more irony, because we know, I mean, we can see the end of the story down here. We know that her time is limited. Even though we have this repetition of days, this polysyndeton of all of these days, all of those, all of the repetition of and this, and this, and this. And so it says she breathed a quick prayer that life might be long. Oh dear. It was only yesterday that she had thought with a shudder that life might be long. So again, we have that parallel structure. And we also get to see her feelings about her life, right? Now she's praying that it might be long as opposed to shuddering. So again, that contrast, that opposition, that antithesis. So finally, it says, she arose at length and opened the door. So she finally opens the door. It says, to her sister's importunities. This is an interesting thing. A door is a barrier, right? So when we're up here looking at how, she has isolated herself, she's given herself the power to isolate herself from her sister and also from all of society. Now we get back down here and it says she opens the door. So she is opening the door. She's also opening herself back up to this return to society. It says there was a feverish triumph in, there was a feverish triumph in her eyes, and she carried herself unwittingly like a goddess of victory. So two things I want to point out here. This idea of a feverish triumph. We have this idea of physical illness here. Even in the midst of her triumph, we start to see this foreshadowing of the bad thing that is about to happen. And it says she's carrying herself like a goddess of victory. And so this, of course, shows us this idea that she's won the prize, but not for long. So it says she clasped her sister's waist. So again, she rejoins herself to society by rejoining herself to her sister. And it says here, They descended the stairs. This is an interesting thing to think about. It means they're going down. And so symbolically, figuratively, a descent is not good, right? You descend into hell. You descend from triumph. You descend, and bad things happen, right? So she is leaving her position of power. And so here, we get to the end. There's kind of a shift in point of view, right? It says someone was opening the front door with a latch key. I want to point out this. We have just been talking about Louise behind the door, right? And nobody can get to her. Her sister can't get to her. Louise has the power because she is the one who has locked the door. But I want us to look, who has a key to the door? Brentley Mallard does, because he is the husband, because he is the person who ultimately has the power. And because he's now alive, this idea of the key and opening the door, that again shows us how he reasserts his power, even though he doesn't know it, right? Like, he doesn't know that this is what's happening. He doesn't know that he's been considered dead. He doesn't know what's been going on. But as the reader, we go, oh, dang it, the door is opening, and it's opening because Brentley Mallard has the key, which means that he has reclaimed all of his power. So it says that he also is calm, right? And he's carrying his grip sack. He's also carrying an umbrella. And this is the callback that I want us to think about. What happened? How is it described when Louise first heard about his death? There was that storm of grief, right? So here we have that callback to the storm of grief. And Brentley Mallard has an umbrella because he's been protected from all of this. It says he had been far from the scene of the accident, didn't even know that there had been one. So it says he stands amazed, and we have this kind of this mirror scene, right? Because this mirrors the opening where we have Josephine and Richards again trying to protect Louise. So we come full circle because what happens at the end? We end with death as well. And so it says she had died of heart disease, of the joy that kills. So here we have the big irony, and I'm going to write irony in big letters because it says, okay, yes, she died of heart disease, and of course we've talked about why that's symbolically interesting. When it says the joy that kills, again, we need to look at the two ways that this is perceived, right? Society sees that as like the joy of Brentley Mallard's return is what kills her. Whereas we, as the readers, we know that it's in some ways the joy of like reclaiming her freedom and having that snatched away and then losing it. That in many ways is what kills her, because she's had this realization. She has had this moment where she has realized, like, oh, well, my life will be so much better. My life will be what I want it to be. She experiences that, the joy of that freedom. And so she can no longer, Louise Mallard, she can no longer live in a world where she doesn't have that freedom. So she can't live in a world where she's chained to her husband. And so in many ways, in this text, death is the only way for her to reclaim this freedom and to reclaim her identity. Freedom and identity. Okay, so there we go. that's where we end Story of an Hour. Thank you guys so much for taking notes. Thank you for making sure that you have all of this. Hopefully it's been insightful, and I appreciate you very much. Thanks, guys.